Is Jimmy Carter a representative of a bygone era in American politics? What about his legacy and the malaise speech and how that was received? And also, how do we look back at 2024 and ahead at 2025? Roshini Rajkumar is a crisis strategist, C-suite advisor, and licensed attorney with core clients that include Fortune 500 brands and their leaders. She is the host of the Crisis Files weekly podcast, which is in pitch stage for TV. And Roshini Rajkumar joins me now. Roshini, welcome back to KOA and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, Jimmy. So wonderful to be with you, and hard to believe it's the last couple of days of the year.
Yes, it is. It is. The time has flown by, and I'm wondering how in the world did we just about get to 2025? We'll get to that in a moment. Let's start with the one president to go by the name Jimmy, which I sure appreciate. Nothing against James Madison or James Buchanan, but it's one thing I've always liked about Jimmy Carter. Something about that name, Jimmy. I don't know what it is, but we heard right there.
There's a nice ring to it, right?
It really does. We heard right there President Biden talk about a bygone era represented by Jimmy Carter. Do you think that that is an accurate assessment of what he said, and that he also said it's not exact? He's not exactly from a bygone era. We can still do this sort of thing.
I think we could still do this. What I would love is the ethics, the integrity that was just part of the DNA of Jimmy Carter. I hope that all of us as Americans, but especially our leaders, can be inspired by that, because his integrity and ethics are just so pervasive and so well known. It was just part of his personal brand. And so to some degree, there were more and more who lived that way. Even if they weren't as ethical, they still lived with a little more decorum between the parties and among their own party. So I would love to see the inspiration, and maybe in his passing, kind of in a way symbolic, as the last Sunday of the year, the last church-going day, if you're a Christian, of the year, Jimmy Carter passes before, 3 weeks before a new president comes into office and the current Democrat says goodbye. It's pretty symbolic, and maybe he is trying to give us something, even in his death, something aspirational that we can all go into 2025 with.
Do you think that it is bygone, that we have sort of lost what we had in those decades?
Yeah, I do. I think there were some things from those decades, though, that we could keep in the past. And that is, there have been strides for women's rights, minority rights, other things. I think some of those things, how they were when Jimmy Carter first became a politician in Georgia, that we don't want to return to. But so much of what he stood for and how he behaved, and how people and politicians coming up with Jimmy Carter behaved, as far as trying to work across the aisle and work on compromise and really try to look at people in a non-discriminatory way. Those are things, sadly, that are of a bygone era that I think could be and should be resuscitated.
Now, I would be remiss as we reflect a little bit on Jimmy Carter if I didn't ask you, as the host of the Crisis Files, about a seminal moment, one of the most seminal moments in Carter's administration, when he gave a speech that it goes by a word that was never used in the speech. It's called the malaise speech, but he literally uses the word crisis in talking about a crisis of confidence. I want to play about a minute of this speech and then get your expert take on its significance.
It is a crisis of confidence. It is a crisis that strikes at the very heart and soul and spirit of our national will. We can see this crisis in the growing doubt about the meaning of our own lives and in the loss of a unity of purpose for our nation. The erosion of our confidence in the future is threatening to destroy the social and the political fabric of America. The confidence that we have always had as a people is not simply some romantic dream or a proverb in a dusty book that we read just on the 4th of July. It is the ideal which founded our nation and has guided our development as a people. Confidence in the future has supported everything else. Public institutions and private enterprise, our own families, and the very Constitution of the United States. Confidence has defined our course.
The beginning of the end of the Carter presidency, they say, from this speech and his reaction to the way the public was approaching the energy crisis and more. Looking back, how do you view this speech?
Wow. I mean, it was really prophetic, wasn't it? I mean, you could almost plop down those same words into 2024 United States of America, because there is a crisis of confidence in the future. And we saw so many of those narratives happening around the election this year. But I think what Carter stood for, what he continued to stand for, definitely after leaving the presidency, was that we can have hope for the future. And he built the rest of his life and his legacy on giving back and public service and that injection of public service that we could all do for our own country and for our own communities. I mean, it's really amazing that he used that term, crisis and crisis of confidence, Jimmy. And I'm so glad you brought that out today, because we see that things do change, but a lot of things stay the same. And I do think that one of the beacons in the world is the United States of America. And even though we've gone through various crises the last decade and lapses in our confidence as a nation and in each other, we have the seeds and we have all the ingredients to get that back and to be more robust. And one of the things I want to say, too, about Carter's legacy, you know, a lot of times people say he was not an effective president because of the Iran hostages, all of the different things. But there was, I want to say about 6 weeks ago, a wonderful column in the Wall Street Journal, and it was someone who had been both a Republican and Democrat in the House or the Senate during the time of Carter, and so really had a lot of experience with Carter. And he wrote how President Carter was responsible for deregulating a lot of spaces
he did.
that we take for granted today. And one of my favorite examples is the airline industry. There was a time when only the elites could fly, and now almost anyone can get on a plane. And it was because Jimmy Carter deregulated that industry and brought in the price competition and making it an affordable thing for most Americans to be able to do. And that was just one example of many that, because I was a child when he was president, I don't remember. And it was really, really interesting and insightful reading about all of those things he did in that short one term. Yeah,
it was the airline, rail, and trucking industries and increasing competition, productivity, more as a result of that. And so that is one aspect of his legacy as a president that actually was good. There were a few, the Camp David Accords, quite significant, but folks really look back at his post-presidency. Even one listener texting in on the KOA Common Spirit Health text line at 56690 saying Jimmy Carter is one of the worst presidents in history. But he says, I'll give you that Jimmy did good after his presidency and had some of a moral compass. And that is something that I think everybody's talking about, is the dichotomy between his presidency and his post-presidency, and how you can see a human being act after defeat and continue for decades and decades on. A real quick final thought on President Carter.
Yes, well, I think he always had a moral compass. I just think a lot of things were going against him during his presidency that most of the country didn't always see it, because we were so thrown by inflation, by the oil crisis, by the hostages being taken. So I am happy for him that he and Rosalind did so much post-presidency, what they did for not only the United States, but for the entire world. I think is something that he can be very happy where he is now.
Sure.
His legacy is strong.
Roshini Rajkumar, our guest, host of the Crisis Files podcast, thecrisisfiles.com. Roshini, when we look at this year now and look back at 2024 and the level of intensity that our politics have gotten, How do you look through that lens? And maybe there's a little bit of a lens of history there too, but look back at 2024, especially from this idea of a crisis that we are almost in a state of perma-crisis as a nation. And we saw that bear out, and the American people said, you know what, we really need change, even if it means going back to the guy before this guy in Joe Biden, now going back to Donald Trump.
We are definitely in a state of perma-crisis. I don't see that changing for a while. But one thing that 2024 and the whole election and all its narratives and then the final conclusion have brought us is that both parties, the Republicans, the Democrats, were pretty out of touch with the American people. And what this election cycle showed us is you can't just cram a candidate down the American people's throat. You can't have a sitting president be lazy and have his eye off the ball and even questioning whether he's running the nation. And it's going to just get by. I mean, the American people are going to stand up and fight for themselves. And that's what happened with the 2024 election. And yes, it did mean going back to a former president who's a controversial guy, very large personality. Not a lot of people like him. But we shall see. He's made some interesting as well as some courageous selections for his cabinet positions. We'll see what happens with whether all or if any, I think many will get confirmed, but really going for the populism of the nation, not the entrenched politics of the nation. That's what I see Trump has meant for the country, and that is what the Democrats need to take as a lesson. And you know I'm a centrist. The Democrats have to take as a lesson that their vision, their plans, their strategy failed. Don't go back to the same thing. Take the lessons. That's what happens when you're the losing party in life and politics and sports. You take the lessons of the loss and you come back, hopefully like a phoenix, even better. And you don't sit there and throw mud at the victors. You move on and you try to have your own victories moving forward. So that's what I would like to see both parties doing. Definitely the Democrats have some lessons, but the Republicans also have some lessons because they are not a unified party right now. Even if they are controlling our government coming into 2025, they're not unified. So both parties need to listen to what the American people said, even no matter who they voted for.
Right.
Listen to what they said.
You know, you touched on something that made me think about the dichotomy between Biden and Trump and how we are viewing them right now. Trump seems to be almost like the quasi-president at this moment, as Biden is hardly out in public at all. I can't remember the last time since the election that I saw him until yesterday when he spoke about Jimmy Carter and his passing. Harold Ford Jr., a Democrat former congressman on Fox News, made an observation I think was very pointed and important about the way that Trump is sort of dominating things at this moment.
I give President Trump a lot of credit. President Biden is kind of off the scene here. President Trump is dominating things, and he is bringing the most successful, the wealthiest people to Americans, that is, to Mar-a-Lago. And I hope as he brings these foreign leaders that he understands, and I'm sure he does, that these are not real estate projects. These are serious people, wealthy people, successful people, many of them elected leaders. And I think the American people, including me, are giving him the benefit of the doubt as he tries to make our border more safe and secure, and as he tries to ensure that prices come down for everything from groceries to insurance. And obviously gas is coming down a little bit now, but to everything that we buy. So he will continue to get the benefit of the doubt, the president. And I think the country will be looking to see who shows up for New Year's Eve.
What do you make of that?
Yeah, well, it says a lot because that's coming from someone within Biden's own party. And it is very interesting to think about the visuals that have been happening. You know how important optics are. I was stunned when Donald Trump was the one who went to the Army-Navy game and not President Biden. I mean, that was a really bad sign for Biden. And what I would say is Biden has created some of his own sad ending to his political life, this legacy. It could have been such a much better legacy, let's put it that way, had he not tried to run again, had he not even run in the first place for president. But here we are now at kind of the lowest of the low. I have to feel some sympathy for Biden, but really nothing else, because he floated in it and he made that happen. But hopefully what we're seeing is the country can just move forward, unify. And what I'd like to see from Donald Trump and his team is that they're not going to mudsling against the Democrats, that Trump will continue. He said at one point, whether you voted for me or not, I'm your president, especially if you didn't vote for me. I'm still your president. And I really hope that he will live that out, Jimmy.
One other thing going into 2025 as we wrap up with you, Roshini Rajkumar, is, look, that crisis of confidence speech from Carter, sure, it was a phrase that resonates, but that speech was known as the malaise speech because the American people didn't resonate with it. They felt that he was utterly tone deaf and out of touch with them, and that eventually helped lead to Ronald Reagan winning in the 1980 presidential election. So when you look at whatever crises Trump will face starting next year, because we know genuine crises will develop and probably pretty quickly under the next Trump administration, how would you advise a President Trump or others to speak to the American people when it comes to a crisis, to give them a boost in confidence while also maybe occasionally recognizing and acknowledging the gravity of the situations that they face?
People want transparency. People want honesty. So no matter who you are, and especially if you're the president of the United States, you need to be transparent and honest. It doesn't mean you're giving away all the nuclear codes, but it does mean when something is dire, you say, this isn't a great situation. We're working on it. Here's what I can tell you now. The team will be able to tell you more later. It's not really rocket science. And so sadly, the current administration has been lying and not transparent to us. And at some point, that kind of strategy is going to be something that the American people see through, and they did see through it. So my advice is absolutely stay honest, stay transparent, stay real. Those are things that usually Donald Trump did well. However, the honesty piece, sometimes he, tends to exaggerate. I think some of that he could sort of just calm down a bit. But stay honest, stay transparent, stay real, and the American people will forgive you for things, and they will be on your side.
It will be fascinating to see what happens with the start of the second Trump presidency. Again, the first president since 1892 with Grover Cleveland to win a second non-consecutive term. Roshini Rajkumar, host of the Crisis Files podcast. Check out the website for all the podcasts. What number are you on now?
I'm glad you asked. Case file number 128, Hot Takes. And this is myself with two members of my crisis squad giving our predictions for 2025. So I hope all your listeners check it out on thecrisisfiles.com or where they find podcasts.
Yes, this most especially that iHeartRadio app. Roshini Rajkumar, thanks so much for joining us, and Happy New Year, my friend. Appreciate your takes this year.